menichu v'simchu, oy oy menichu v'simchu, menichu v'simchu, oy 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 layidim, menichu v'simchu, oy layidim, yovovoim shabuzoim, yovovoim machudim, yoim shabuzoim, yoim machudim, oy vay oy vay oy vay oy oy, yovovoim yovovoim machudim.
Shavuot Tov Morach, good and a blessed week. Today, the 18th of the month of Kislev, the year 5777, corresponding to the 18th of December, the year 2016. This month, the reconciliation of the Torah date and the secular calendar date is easy, and the 25th of Kislev will be next Sunday. And since the Torah way is to have the day start at nightfall of the preceding evening, the first night of Hanukah and the first light of the Festival of Lights will be kindled, God willing, this coming Saturday night after nightfall, after the exit of the Shabbat. We will continue drawing the Shabbat into our homes with the new lights of Hanukah. It is on Shabbat and on Yom Tov, on the festival, that the lighting of the candles is an integral part of the observance. We mark the greater spiritual light of the day by having greater physical light in our homes, in our rooms, in the place where we eat. On Hanukah, we take this very exalted light and ideally put the candelabrum right at the entrance to our home where the light can shine out into the street, or if that's not possible, if we have a window that overlooks the street, we put the candelabrum there, and if we don't have either, then we light the candelabrum in a conspicuous place where we live in the home, where the members of the household will be passing by and seeing this beautiful tranquil light of the Hanukah lights that come to signify the victory of the force of light over darkness. And indeed, way back in a primordial history of humanity, there was always a festival of light in the middle of the winter. And this is recorded in the Talmud, in the early pages of the tractate Avodah Zarah of the Babylonian Talmud, which discusses the origins of the pagan winter festivals in the life of Adam, who, according to our tradition, was born on Rosh Hashanah, the sixth day of creation. The creation of man occurred on Rosh Hashanah, and Adam was created, sinned, and repented on the same day. And with his repentance came the gift of the Shabbat. But as time went on, as the months of Tishrei and Cheshvan passed, Adam noticed that the nights were getting shorter and shorter. The days were getting shorter and shorter. The nightfall was getting earlier and earlier, and the light of the morning was coming later and later. And he feared that the world was coming to an end, and that the cycle of day and night was just degenerating into more and more darkness, until there came the winter solstice, which we this week celebrate on the 21st of Kislev, the 21st of December, the shortest day of the year. And after that, the days do indeed become longer. And when Adam saw that the world was not coming to an end, he instituted a holy festival, thanksgiving to God Almighty for giving the world renewed light and life. And it was only with the generation of the generations into paganism that the winter festival of thanksgiving turned into what it has turned into. But I think particularly in our time now, and particularly as we watch what has been going on in Europe, Britain with their decision to leave the European community, what has happened in North America, in the United States with the results of the presidential election that defied all the predictions and the prognostications, what is happening in Israel with a distinct change in the feel and the mood and the tone. We have this year many, many reasons to give thanks. And it's not just about whether your favorite candidate was elected, whether the British referendum had a result that you agreed with or not. It's more than just politics. We are definitely witnessing a new light shining in the world and across the world. And it is on Hanukah that we give thanks for this light. This is really a miracle that despite the attacks of the forces of darkness, when many thought that all was lost or about to be lost, we see an amazing resurgence. And I'd like to discuss today what exactly is it that we are giving thanks for. The overthrow of what are we giving thanks for on Hanukah? The outlines of the Hanukah story are known to most people. Hanukah is one of two rabbinically ordained festivals, the other being Purim. Purim, although it comes later in the year, actually chronologically the miracle of Purim occurred considerably earlier, a couple of hundred years before the Hanukah miracle, when the destroyers of King Solomon's temple, the Babylonians, had taken Judah into captivity, and then Babylon fell, and the people of Judah in exile became subject to the Persian Empire. And it was in the time between the destruction of King Solomon's temple and the rebuilding of the second temple that the Purim miracle occurred, where the forces of evil took control over the Persian Empire and determined to make a mass pogrom on the 13th of the month of Adar, and the miracle ensued through the great surge of teshuvah, the repentance that occurred in that generation. And after the Purim miracle, the way became opened up for the building of the second temple. And after the building of the second temple under the auspices of the Persian Empire, that empire was overthrown by the Greeks through the person of Alexander the Great, who was thrusting outwards and bringing Greek government and Greek culture across the then known world, across and around the whole Mediterranean basin and into Asia. And this was a most decisive historical event, because never in history had there been a culture of the sophistication, the grace, the artistic beauty, the literary outstandingness, and the depth of the philosophy of the Greeks. And their expanding culture was an aggressive culture which could not tolerate the Torah of Israel. Certain aspects of the Torah of Israel were just abhorrent in the eyes of the Greek people. Customs like the refusal to wear a garment containing both wool and linen at the same time. The refusal to cook together or consume dishes made of meat with milk. The absolute refusal to eat the very tasty meat of the swine, which the Greeks greatly revered. The absolute dogged insistence on a day of complete abstinence from even the slightest act of labor on the Sabbath, and all kinds of other dogged customs of Israel, none perhaps more than the act of the circumcision of the male children, were healthy on the 8th day after their birth. That, in the eyes of the Greeks, was the mutilation of the natural human form that cut into the entire pleasure and enjoyment of the act of intimacy, and was considered to be an absolutely abhorrent, primitive custom that must be abolished. Indeed, when the Greek government solidified itself in the land of Israel, the Greeks wanted to impose upon Israel Hellenistic culture, and there was a large number of the population of the Jews of Judea that were in favor of this. There were many of the more sophisticated people that considered the Greek culture of the time to be the very epitome of human progress and advance. And indeed, you see the influence of Greek architecture in structures that date back to those times. And so many of the actual people were influenced by this culture, and among the decrees of the Greek government were 3 that were intended to totally undermine the entire tradition of Israel. And they were the abolition of circumcision, the abolition of the Shabbat, and the abolition of counting of the calendar by the lunar month, the abolition of Rosh Chodesh, the new moon. These were 3 of the most serious decrees of the Greeks, and it's well known that the 8 days of Hanukah actually are a triumph over these 3 decrees, because if a male child was born on the first day of Hanukah, it would have his circumcision, the bris milah, on the 8th day, on the last day of Hanukah. So it's possible to have a bris milah on Hanukah, where the baby is born and circumcised on Hanukah. The second is that Hanukah always contains at least 1 Shabbat, as this year, and sometimes it contains 2 Shabbats. And the third is that Hanukah always comes at the end of the month of Kislev and stretches into the month of Tevet. There is always a Rosh Chodesh during the festival of Hanukah. Sometimes Rosh Chodesh is celebrated for 2 days, sometimes for 1 day, as this year. That depends upon the way that the Torah calendar works out to synchronize the lunar calendar with the solar calendar. But Hanukkah always has the Shabbat, the Brit Milah, and the Rosh Chodesh. And those are triumph against classical Greek conceptions, that the Brit Milah was considered to be a violation of the natural order, that the concept of running your calendar by the moon was also a violation of the solar calendar, which is far more logical and easy to run by, and everybody runs by the solar calendar. And the third, the concept of the Shabbat, which is a complete violation of what in the eyes of non-Israelites is the orderly running of the world, where people are the working classes are working all the time. And there's no concept that there is such a thing as a Shabbat, that the world was created, as it were, through 6 days of creation. On the 7th, the Creator somehow rested. All of these were considered quite laughable by the Greeks, who had, particularly among their philosophers, a very rationalistic bent and wanted everything to be understandable and comprehensible in human terms. As we would put it today, everything had to be scientifically validated. The Greeks had a different kind of science, a different view of science, but the overall attitude to the world was that if we can feel it, see it, hear it, experience it, then we can test it and we can validate its existence. But anything that requires a leap of faith, a leap of emunah, is ruled out of court. And here we see exactly the reflection of Hellenism in contemporary society. Let us understand that the very spearhead of Hellenism was the cultured upper classes of Greece. People think that Greece was the mother of democracy. Well, to some degree, it could be that classical Athens had a democracy, as did some other Greek states, but these were not democracies in the sense that is understood when we talk about contemporary democracy, where everybody who is a citizen, everybody who is over a certain age, be it 16 or 18 or 21, is entitled to their one vote. And the decisions are supposedly made according to the will of the majority of the voters. Well, of course, much of this is entirely fictitious, and that's not the way that governments actually run. But in classical Greece, where you had a little city like Athens compared to the contemporary metropolis, Athens was not much more than a sort of a village that had turned into a town with a rather smart town center, and certainly great artwork. But there can't have been more than a few free men that were actually citizens. And they did have their meetings in the market, and they were addressed by the different orators and would cast their votes. But even the Greeks got tired of democracy, and that was not what Alexander the Great was intending to propagate. Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon, was actually a devotee of Aristotle, the great philosopher Aristotle, who commanded the admiration not only of the nations of the world, but also of some major Jewish rabbis, including Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and others, and certainly the greatness of Aristotle as a thinker and a logician and a philosopher was recognized by the Torah sages, and the name Aristo is known as a name. But the philosopher Aristotle was actually the pupil of a more readily accessible philosopher who we know as Plato. And Plato was far from being any kind of democrat, whether in the sense of of classical Athens, let alone the contemporary world. In fact, from Plato's writings, and particularly from his major philosophical political work, which is the work known as Plato's Republic, we see that Plato was unrelenting elitist, who saw the world as being divided into the great mass of the proletariat, whose job was to work and keep everything going, a class of managers who would make sure that these serfs would do their work, and sitting at the very top, an elite of philosopher kings who were sitting in their armchairs and contemplating the eternal forms of existence, and as a kind of side activity, trying to promote some vague knowledge of these eternal forms on the part of the common people, to even share the great enlightenment that these armchair philosophers were thought to have had with the wider public in whatever way might be possible. This was a very elitist view of what human society is and how it should be run. By Plato's time, the Greeks had got rid of any kind of residual actual belief in the gods of their myths. They were merely artistic decorations. But as far as Plato was concerned, the mythological gods of the Greeks were not really real forces. The real forces of the universe were some impersonal, eternal forms with which the only connection people could have was through some kind of level of cognition coming through meditation, contemplation, austere training in mathematics and logic. And this would lead the philosopher kings to be able, from their armchairs, to govern all the rest of us. Well, now, this, in very broad terms, was the kind of government that Alexander was bringing across the world to all of these people that had levels of culture which was far behind that of the Greeks. The kinds of cultures of Egypt and Assyria and the rest of the Middle East were all only too eager to integrate and to devour aspects of Greek culture and join them with their own cultures. And the culture that the Greeks brought with them and they wanted to impose upon Judea was entirely inimical to the Torah view of the world. And it's precisely this elitist aspect of Greek philosophy, particularly as exemplified by the teachings of Plato and his disciple Aristotle. It's precisely here through this elitism that we see the connection between the contemporary world and the neo-Hellenism that we have in the world today, which is actually being brought to us just like this very discussion coming to you from a little room here in Jerusalem all the way through the global internet to wherever you are seated right now at this moment and listening to this. We're all part of this contemporary matrix which imposes its own forms upon our lives. And this is developed particularly with a very steep incline upwards of progress over the last couple of centuries, probably for a good 2,000 years after Plato. Many aspects of European society, European economies, and North America and the rest of the world were changed relatively slowly. It was only with the Industrial Revolution and with the huge steps forward in the last century in communications and other technologies that we've reached where we are today. And all of this has happened not without the armchair philosopher kings. In our time, these armchair philosopher kings may start their careers in universities as professors of political science or some other aspect, and they may graduate to think tanks, and they may get up in the ranks until they are inducted into the higher mysteries of groups that have been conducting government for centuries and centuries. And there is today an elite that is far from conspicuous in the view of the mass media. They indeed control the mass media. They control the mainstream media of communication, be they internet, be they television, be they radio, be they the major magazines, the major newspapers. And the contemporary Hellenism is a worldview that is shared by the elites that control these media, particularly in America, in Europe, and in many other parts of the world. So that today there has developed a consensus among the media that rule themselves to be mainstream and rule out what they consider to be fake media, fake news. But there is a kind of consensus about the principles that should govern the life of countries across the world and civilization today. These are in many ways represented in the United Nations itself, which is the product of the hidden secret governors of the world, which was set up in various incarnations from the time of the First World War as an offspring of earlier diplomacy, and developed into what has become the extremely ineffectual organization we know as the United Nations today, which is not capable of stopping bloodshed and cruelty as we see in Syria today, as we have seen in Iraq, as we're seeing in other parts. It's not capable of doing that, but is capable of having very highly paid officials who travel around in jets, first class, and stay in top accommodation, and have fat salaries. And these people are the ones who are determining the cultural norms that should govern the world. And the cultural norms that should govern the world are propagated by organizations like the United Nations, which, for example, is absolutely committed to population control and therefore to the availability of abortions and therefore the availability of all kinds of other ways of reducing the world's population. The United Nations is committed to what are called human rights, which today are understood by the systems of Europe and America to include the rights of not only people who follow the traditional morality of men marrying women and raising families in a protective home atmosphere, but also consider it the right of any deviant and any alternative lifestyle practitioner to have equal benefits and equal recognition. All of this is turned into the consensus culture which is being spread by all of the mainstream media across mainstream education. It would be unthinkable in any self-respecting university, for example, to approach in a serious way creationism as an alternative to the non-scientific and atheistic evolutionism, which is taught in biology across school systems and across universities and considered to be totally mainstream. Whereas if anybody has the audacity to suggest that there was a guiding hand behind evolution, and this we call creation, they are ruled out of court. They're not part of the dialogue. They're not part of the if anybody witnessed some very telling video footage of how this ostracism works, was actually witnessed in a meeting just last week of all of the leaders of the European Union, against whom Britain is now in rebellion because the British do not, at least a majority of the British, do not want their legal system to be totally taken over by these neo-Hellenists in Strasbourg, who have the most extreme ideas about what justice demands in contemporary society. The British rebelled against Europe. The British are now supposedly in the process of what they call Brexit. Whether they will succeed is another question, but as a punishment for this rebellion, the heads of the European Union are not only promising the British a very painful exit from the cultural monopoly, but at the meeting last week, to which, as a present member of the European Union, Britain is still sent a representative. They sent the British Prime Minister, and there was explicit video footage which was seen across the internet of the very awkward few minutes when the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, was at the gathering with everybody milling around and having their cocktail party conversation, and poor Theresa May could do nothing except sort of play with her wrist because nobody would talk to her. In other words, here the Prime Minister of a country of millions and millions of people is completely ostracized because the majority of the country voted to get out of this aggressive cultural monopoly which plays out through the European Union. Well, now, the very fact that the British did opt to rebel, the very fact that huge numbers of Americans did opt to rebel against the the administration presently ensconced in America and its representatives and vote into the presidency somebody with a completely different set of values and a completely different world outlook. That is part of the overall Hanukah miracle that we are witnessing today. I have not, and I'm not endorsing Mr. Donald Trump as Messiah or anything other than the elected president of the United States. I'm not going to promise that he will be a good or a bad president. However, one thing that we have seen in the course of his making his appointments in recent weeks to his coming administration is a complete reversal of some of the most distinguishing lines of the neo-Hellenism that I believe has actually been significantly thwarted by his election. Now, this applies both in the what will be with the Supreme Court of the United States, what will be with the interpretation of the Constitution, approaches to America's internal policy, their economic policy, but particularly with respect to Israel, the changes in the personnel involved in America's foreign policy, and an entirely different atmosphere. The very fact that there is talk of United States moving their embassy to Israel's capital city, which is none other than the city of Jerusalem, is a huge shift from what we have been seeing now for years and years. Again, until the shift of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem actually occurs, we'll have to wait to see it before we will believe it. But the very change in the tone of the dialogue has led to, certainly in Israel, an atmosphere of considerable optimism, I would say, that for the first time in decades, Israelis in the land of Israel will be more confidently able to stand up for the rights of Israel to the land of Israel. Now, here in Israel, we see this neo-Hellenism in an extremely powerful form, I would say embodied in the Supreme Court of the State of Israel. The Supreme Court has a panel of judges that are essentially self-selecting. If we're talking about an elite that share certain common values, that will be the Supreme Court of the State of Israel, who are more concerned to satisfy the judges and legal authorities of Strasbourg than they are to actually promote the vision of the justice of the Torah, both for Israel and for the nations of the world. Here is where the neo-Hellenism really comes right into the way that Israel as a country today works. And it is not for nothing that one cites what happens in the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court of Israel have, over the last 30 years, have had a galloping, aggressive takeover of Israeli democracy, to the point where the judges of the Supreme Court see it within their purview to determine the legality of any legislation that might be passed by a majority of the Israeli elected Knesset. And the judges of the Supreme Court again and again determined that actions which the elected government wishes to take are against the law and against the Constitution, shows that the judges of the Supreme Court, with their attitudes and with their ideology, which is a Hellenistic, elitist ideology that the mass of the people need the guidance of these armchair philosopher kings and need to have their affairs managed for them in a way that fits with the conceptions of justice of these people, even though this flies completely in the face of Torah justice. This penetrates the society of Israel in a terrifying way. There is presently a case that's been going on for months, which you are very likely to be familiar with, of an Israeli soldier who shot at a terrorist who had come to kill Israelis. And he shot at the terrorist after the terrorist was already, as the expression is, neutralized. The terrorist was lying on the ground, and the soldier holds that he believed that this terrorist, although neutralized, still had explosives that he was about to detonate and would have done damage. This soldier, having shot at the terrorist on the ground, is up for trial for murder. Now, this is an astonishing case. We're waiting for the verdict, which is due in the coming days. It's an astonishing case, typical of many other similar cases where Israeli soldiers have been hauled before law courts for taking what any normal person would see as natural and entirely legitimate self-defense. And this is an example of the Hellenism gone mad of the elite that governs the Israeli judicial system and indeed governs the thinking of many of the leading people in the Israeli army, who feel that the Israeli army has to have a level of ethical behavior that is willing to put the lives of its soldiers at risk in order to protect the human rights of terrorists who want to have those soldiers killed. This is an example of the Hellenistic thinking that is taken over Israel, that is also to which the Israeli Prime Minister himself, although he presents himself as a man of the solid right and a man of the people, nevertheless, over and over again bows to the elitist decisions of the small Hellenistic clique that control the law courts of Israel, control the army, control the mainstream Israeli media, the broadcasting, and the other main media of the country. So if we're coming to now celebrate Hanukah, although it's customary to have donuts and to have all kinds of light-hearted activities, Hanukah really comes out of a war. The passages that we add to our prayers on Hanukah, passages of thanksgiving, speak about the war that God made for the Maccabees and for the people of Israel in the generation of the Hanukah miracle. And this is a war today. The war of culture is not necessarily a war of weapons. The war of culture is one that rapes little children in their youngest years and already imprints on their minds through television advertising, through all of the media that are geared to our children to corrupt their minds and plant images into their minds from earlier childhood. This has been going on since the development of animated movies with Walt Disney. It's well known that the Walt Disney adorable, beautiful, charming movies actually contain all kinds of symbolism that enters into the minds of the little children, and they're already there on their path to be taken over by Hellenism. And Hanukah in our time and always is about the home and the sanctity of the home. Hanukah is about the sanctity of the family in the home, together lighting the candles of Hanukah, which symbolize the continuity of the Torah until our times, the continuity of Shabbat. the continuity of the Brit Milah, the circumcision, the continuity of Rosh Chodesh and all of the festivals that we set through Rosh Chodesh. It's a war. There are people across the world who want today to ban circumcision. There are movements of Jewish people in North America and elsewhere in the world who feel that circumcision is an affront to human dignity, to the right of the newborn child to choose his future, and should be banned. There's a constant struggle by observant Jewish communities in North America, in Britain, in Europe to be able to continue with the practice of Brit Milah, of circumcision. This is an example of the war of the Neo-Hellenism against Israel. In our time, the war of culture which promotes every kind of deviation from the Torah value of man and wife, mother and father, the continuity of the tradition. The culture that is being promoted today by our elites who control governments, judiciaries, and the media is a culture really truly modeled on the Platonic conception that the citizen is simply owned by the state. It is this Platonic conception of the world that is embedded in the communist system. It's embedded in the kind of socialism that is being promoted in our time by the failed presidential candidate in the United States election and by other socialists across the world, that the individual is owned by the state. And when Hanukah comes into our home and we light the candles to promote the miracle among our children, family members, members of our household, we are flying in the face of that Hellenism. We are not owned by the state. We are owned by God. We are God's servants, God's creatures. Our job is to serve God. And on Hanukah, we are asserting how it is the light of the Torah that not only shines to us, but shines out through our windows of our homes to the wider world. And the shining of the Hanukah light is a signal to us that we have to shine the light of the Torah not only during the festival of Hanukah, but all the time now we have to play our part in this war of culture by affirming and asserting the values of the Torah. They include the values of modesty, because that's part of the purity of family life, of the relations between man and wife. This is actually something that Judaism shares in common with Islam, where we see today that many Islamic women are pressing for a greater modesty of dress. And here again, there is a war of cultures. It's a war of cultures that in contemporary Israel today has been won so far by the Hellenists. Just go to the beach in Tel Aviv or walk through the streets of some Israeli cities in the summer, walk through downtown Jerusalem in the hot summer and see the way that Israelis may be dressed. We see that so far we've not come to this modesty, but you and I who are striving to follow the true path of the Torah have it incumbent upon us to adopt the standards of modesty. It need not be in a very aggressive way. We don't need to have our women all suddenly covering their faces completely with or putting on burqas, but we do need, unquestionably, in our Torah communities to affirm and assert the purity of family life, which is founded upon modesty. And this indeed is part of the whole commandment of the circumcision, to circumcise our hearts and to serve God through the purity of our hearts. We need to be talking about the unity of God and God's laws to humanity, and the Noahide laws. We need to be promoting the true civilization. True civilization goes against the contemporary idea that willful terrorists need to have their human rights affirmed. They need to be eliminated completely. And so Hanukah is really a war of cultures, and through our lighting of our Hanukah candles and our acknowledgement of God's miracles, we are seeing, we can see, and we will see that the eternal light of the Torah will continue to shine and will grow stronger and stronger. And this is our hope for redemption in our time. I'd like to say shalom to you from Jerusalem. This time next week, we will not be having classes because the timing of our classes coincides with the lighting of the candles here in Jerusalem. I will be notifying through Azamra mailing lists the schedule of classes in the coming weeks. I would like those of you who will not be joining us for our college classes during this week to wish you Shavua Tov and a happy and a truly meaningful Hanukkah. We do this week have college classes tomorrow, Monday, and on Wednesday and Thursday. We have come to very fascinating sections of the book of Proverbs of Solomon towards the end, and very fascinating sections of our Mishneh studies in Tractate Chulin, where we from now on will be looking at subjects that directly impinge upon our keeping kosher in our kitchens today in the contemporary era. With that, my dear friends, I do wish you Shavua Tov Morach and a happy Hanukkah.
בלילה נעירה יודעו שילכו בקי שור בחפיו תמחיפו בולה כפה ברסו ליוני ויודעו שילכו לו ויין לו סיול בייסמי שול כי כל בייסלו בישוני Rabbi Mosesula Shajvar Gomor Levisha Noida Bashur Balo Shiftoim Zigna Yure Sudinos Subatim Nikoi Vakoi Nosnu Lahagnani Ois Veyudor Levisha Vatischak Lioi Macheroi Yu Posu Bechachmu Besoy Rasveiser Alishoyno Zoy fi you ali khoyz vayso Belechem atzlis loy zay Kumi bune you vayashvi you Mahalo az Hashem itisalo tnilo mi priyu beyu yalili u bashurim aseyu